Hello and welcome to People, Politics and Power. I am Imoni Amarere from here in the Nigerian capital, Abuja. The Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC, Nigeria's central electoral management body, on Friday presented a report on the 2019 general elections in Nigeria. The report was presented by the chairman of the commission, Professor Mahmood Yakubu. The report is in 13 chapters and captures the Commission's preparations for the elections, the conduct of the general, supplementary, and court-ordered elections, and the organization of the counting, collation, and declaration centers at every level. That's from local government up to the federal level. The report identifies some critical issues that arose during the conduct of the elections and made 180 recommendations on measures to enhance the quality and credibility of future elections. According to the Commission, some of the recommendations require administrative actions by the electoral body itself, while others require legislative backing by the National Assembly before implementation. Now, to be sure, the report is actually a narrative by the electoral body of its activities and, if you will, a self-assessment of its performance in the 2019 elections, which it says was the largest electoral exercise so far undertaken in the history of elections in Nigeria. The elections were contested by 91 political parties in 1,558 constituencies with over 84 million voting population spread across 119,973 polling units and 57,023 voting points. The Commission says it is already implementing some of the recommendations contained in that report, which of course resulted in improved management of electoral processes in the Edo and Ondo state governorship elections, which were held in September and October this year, respectively. We shall examine some of the critical recommendations made in the report, but particularly that on the introduction and deepening of technology in the conduct of elections. Will the deployment of technology necessarily guarantee free, fair, and credible elections in the country? Now, this is not the first time the Commission has carried out a review exercise of its activities and putting forward actionable proposals. But how far and how well have such proposals helped in improving the electoral process and environment, as well as strengthening its procedures? These are some of the issues we shall be engaging with on the program today. When we return, we'll be meeting our guest analysts who are already here in the studio and who are also joining us virtually via Zoom. Stay with us. We'll be bringing you a very robust discussion on the INEC report on the 2019 general elections.
The report examines in detail key activities, preparations, and challenges associated with the conduct of the 2019 general election, ranging from registration of new political parties, conduct of continuous voter registration, monitoring of party primaries, candidates nomination process, and political party campaigns.
But to the global community of election administrators, these documents that you can learn from, but that each other person interested in elections and each election management body around the world can go back to and see what the Nigerian experience was and what they can take from that.
And that is why the Commission has laid a lot of emphasis on openness and transparency, on building trust. And you can see all that trend, in recent elections and all the innovations that the Commission has introduced, all part of this trust building built on openness.
All right, that was the report, but the actual report, the hard copy is a 13-chapter report, hundreds of pages, and of course, it's so voluminous that you cannot, in fact, begin to digest everything there. But on the program today, we shall be trying to look at the very critical aspects, the very important recommendations that have been made in that report as a way of enhancing and deepening the democratic electoral culture in Nigeria. And I'm joined in the studio by three gentlemen. First, from my immediate left is Ohazurike Tochukwu. Ohazurike Tochukwu is the Director, Legal and Documentation at the Center for Transparency Advocacy. Thank you so much for joining us. We're also joined by Yusuf Shamsuddin. Yusuf is the Principal Programs Officer of Center for Democracy and Development. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having us.
We are joined by Ezenwa Nwago. Ezenwa is the Chairman, Partners for Electoral Reforms. Thank you, Ezenwa, for joining us.
Thank you.
And joining us virtually via Zoom is Dr. Abubakar Kari. Dr. Kari is a lecturer at the University of Abuja. As soon as he joins us, he will, of course, be reintroduced. But gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on the program. Well, so where do I begin? I should begin with Ezenwa.
Why?
I'm sure that you are quite familiar with the electoral processes and the electoral programs in Nigeria. This report is a very voluminous one, like I said. It's not one that we can digest in a few days, as it were, because it begins from after the 2015 elections and all the processes and strategies that were put in place, culminating in the 2019 election itself and the review of the 2019 elections, and all the synergies, or what you might describe as the networking that was done with both state and non-state actors in carrying out the 2019 elections. First, let's have your take on that report. What's your summary of what that report looks like?
Well, interestingly, the report is a documentation of activities that we also were direct participants of. So it's not extraneous to us in the sense in which it is that, okay, whether it's the voter registration process, whether it's the election proper, whether it is political party monitoring, whether it's a constituency delimitation, whether it's the voting, whether it's a collation of results. These activities were activities that, as election observers, we followed all through. So this is coming in print, in beautiful print for researchers, for people who have interest. And then more importantly, for lessons, because that's what election observation is about. That's what even the organization itself of election management is, to be able to draw lessons from what has happened in the past. So 2019 elections presented us with a commission, first and foremost, that arrived into conducting elections, never settled down into, when it came in 2015 November, from that point of getting into the commission, it was confronted with the Bayelsa election. And from then onwards, it came into about 15 other governorship, off-cycle governorship elections, and about 160 other constituency-related elections. And so it kept grappling with the issues of conducting and learning on the job. But now with this report, we're able to sit back and take the lessons that we can get in each of the, disaggregating the different stakeholders in the electoral process, meaning how did the electorates themselves behave, how did the security agencies behave, how did the political parties, how did they show in the 2019 election, how did INEC itself, as the the one that sits at the topmost of the pyramid of election stakeholdership, how did it present itself in all of this period. That X-ray is what that report is about. But the report is coming from the eye view of the manager himself. So it is important that other people who had roles to play are able to look at that report and draw critical lessons that can help the electoral process going forward.
So this report, in other words, is not only about the electoral management body, but the roles that every other person or group played in the process.
Absolutely.
All right. Mr. Azurike, some people might ask, how appropriate is it, for instance, that INEC should be appraising itself?
Thank you very much. Ordinarily, one would have said nobody should appraise himself, but having taken some time to go through this report, I've come to see that what INEC succeeded in doing is to do something that is very un-Nigerian. Un-Nigerian in the sense that it has put out a voluminous work there, and knowing the common balance in this part of the world that we do not read much, except if it's in a pamphlet form. But INEC has produced a 413-page report with data enough for political parties, enough for voters, security agencies, the legislature, the executive to read and take action for improvement of elections. So one would now say that it was most appropriate from that point of view that INEC actually presented this report to the public. Because looking at the report, it tells you what happened in 2015, what INEC saw that was good in about 2015 election, it adopted, and the things that were not so good, that it wanted to amend and or change or improve, and the preparatory steps towards conduct of the 2019 elections. So when you look at all these, you see that INEC really took out time. In fact, there was some data I saw in that report that I was like, government agencies don't ordinarily put out reports like this except when you go to them by way of FOI before you can get such data. But INEC just put everything out there. There is absolutely no electoral data concerning the 2019 election that is not contained in that report. So it's an amazing job, and it defeats that idea of that rule of natural justice in this context in a way that you should not be a judge in your own case. INEC was an unbiased judge in his own case in putting out this report. And I think it's recommended for every other electoral stakeholder to do so and bring out their own electoral report.
There's something for every stakeholder in that report that you can pull out and look at very critically and make amends with your own processes.
Particularly pointing out that the reforms and amendments is proposed in 2016, which it proposed that should be used in the 2019 election. There was no amendment of the Electoral Act for that period. So those amendments are coming up again. And it has also specifically recommended that there should be early amendments so that the issues that we saw in 2019, when the president said that the reason he wasn't going to sign the amendments into law was because they were coming so close to the election. Now INEC is proposing at least 12 months to election. Let all amendments be in, so that people will be certain about the set of rules that will be used in the conduct of the election. So to that extent, I think the legislature must sit up now and amend our electoral laws. INEC in 2016 put forward about 46 amendments. None of those were used. Even the ones that were put earlier in 2015, I think it was just about 10% of that, or less than 20, that was used for the 2015 election. That is why we are still using the 2010 Electoral Act as amended, but that was before 2016. So all the set of rules that were used in 2019 were the same set of rules used in 2015, despite the flaws that were identified by the electoral body. So to that extent, we have to accept that there is something tangible for every stakeholder, and now particularly for the legislature, because it is very important that there must be electoral amendments to our rules.
So, Yusuf, what for you are those things that stand out in this report?
Yeah, I think the openness of INEC, and just to show that it's actually independent enough to provide such appraisal to itself. And also to acknowledge the fact that INEC shows that the asset listening here to some of the key demands of other stakeholders, and because I know one of the key information to this would be assessment by different observers group, that sincerely and independently assess the performance of different stakeholders in the last elections, particularly the state actors. So I think what is totally different is the sincerity of INEC to come out to appraise itself and also provide recommendations on how to forge ahead. And one of the key things which a lot of us have been talking much about is to look at the ad hoc officials, people who are working with INEC, to conduct the election, because definitely the main leadership of INEC wouldn't be everywhere to conduct the elections. Definitely, like you mentioned in your introductory part, that we have almost 120,000 polling units across the country, and we have a minimum of at least 3 to 4 ad hoc officials to work to manage elections in those polling units. And definitely the leadership of INEC at the headquarters wouldn't be able to do that. I'm coming out to say that they will look into the process of recruiting the ad hoc officials is quite critical, which a lot of our observers group have been, talking about and demanding for such process to be reviewed, and as well as coalition officer as well, and the returning officer, which even the last election we saw some of the returning officers coming late to the state coalition centers, and we recorded a lot of cases, very funny cases in 2019 elections, which emphasized the need for us to look into those coalition officers, returning officers, and the ad hoc officials who are actually working to deliver on the mandate of INEC in the election. So for me, that is quite crucial, and it also calls on a lot of stakeholders to work with INEC in ensuring that the process of recruiting these critical actors in the process is without any form of compromise or the process that should ensure the credibility of elections. And other thing which I also think which I think is quite important is to acknowledge the fact that a lot of administrative recommendations made in that report, which INEC came out to say that they've started implementing some of these administrative functions, which to them, which we also acknowledge the fact that some of these added value to the last 2 off-season governorship elections that were conducted in Ondo and Edo State, is the fact that some of these, there are other external factors which also INEC needs to consider, and which I also think a lot of stakeholders need to work on, such as the attitude of the political parties. How do we start conversation? I know that in one of the key recommendations is that politicians who is voted into an elected position, particularly the legislative chamber, cannot cross carpet from one party to the other, and there should be constitutional amendment for that. I think that is quite important, and we need to delve more into the issue of party primaries, the issue of internal party democracies, the issue of the attitude of politicians who are the major sponsor of political talks and thuggery during election. And some of these things are quite important because you made mention earlier that there are a lot of emphasis on the application of technology to ensure the credibility of process. As much as we talk about the positive side of technology and the added value it could have on our elections and electoral process, we also need to look at the attitudes of some of these politicians and so on and so forth, which I think is quite critical. So for us, it's the sincerity of INEC in coming out to say that they appraise themselves and they have acknowledged the fact that there are certain administrative things that they have to put in place to ensure credibility of the process, is something that we find quite important.
Let's continue along that line, which is looking at the framework, the legal framework for elections in Nigeria, which of course Tuchukwu spoke about when he talked about the Electoral Act itself. Now, we are just about, is it 17 or 18 months to the next elections? And as we speak, the proposed amendment to the Electoral Act, which did not go before the 2019 elections, is still in limbo. Nobody seems to be talking about it anymore. Until maybe a few months to the next election, and there will be this whole hassle, but even by the politicians and by civil society and everyone talking about a legal framework. And that is mentioned in this report. A legal framework. The administrative recommendations have INEC says is taken care of. But the ones that require legal amendments that have to be dealt with by the legislature are not being dealt with.
Well, so that drives us to first the value of early advocacy. Early advocacy to be able to push for these reforms. But Mark, if you remember, we've made this point about the executive legislative conspiracy against reforms. What does that mean? You create emergencies. You ensure that by the time you start working on these laws, the laws, both international and domestic processes that you need to get these things worked out require a lot of time. So when you create that emergency, the law starts going back and forth from the executive. Oh, they didn't dot the I's, they didn't cross the T's, and there's no more time, and then we go back. So if we start this early to prevail on both the executive, and that is what is significant in a part of that report, about electoral dialogue, multi-stakeholder dialogue for election, which is a part of what the recommendations that INEC put forward. What does that mean? We need to be able to have a situation in which we have security agents, civil society, the media, the legislature, members of the executive in one room, talking about the challenges and the problems of our electoral system, and getting minimum, very clear minimums that each stakeholder can take away and go and work on. And so preceding that should be that dialogue. That multi-stakeholder dialogue has not happened. And if it doesn't happen, you are always going to have a situation in which, people are territorial. When I mean territorial, the executive sees what it thinks is of advantage to it. The legislature, who always also wants to go into the executive, is always thinking in terms of laws that bring advantage rather than a statesmanly approach to lawmaking. And I think that what can push that out will be critical advocacy from the media and civil society to say, look, we have no time now. We have to get into those problems that we all know, that we all have identified in terms of how to move our election forward. And if we don't do that, what we're going to do is to create emergency. And once you create emergency, you sidestep very important issues. And when you sidestep very important issues, that challenge comes. So for me, it's very critical. We need to have that multi-stakeholder dialogue before, in fact, in the next 2 months. And we are fortunate to have INEC peopled by proven reform-minded elements, who undeniably were taken even from, the Jega period. Most of them were elevated. Some of them were brought in as resident electoral commissioners, with them in the driving seat of putting out in transparent, open manner, in the way we have seen this report. In that kind of dialogue, we'll be able to, draw a scheme that can help us to put both the pressure on the National Assembly and the executive to come to one place. The Minister of Justice, Attorney General, will have a role to play sitting with the National Assembly, so that you don't come to a situation in which you are advising the president on issues that are already taken care of in this multi-stakeholder dialogue that we talk about. So we need to come to that point where we are in one room. There are challenges with our security provisioning for elections. There are challenges with vendor issues, whether it is NURTW,
procurement and all of that.
Procurement, yes, single elections like the ones that we had in Ondo and Edo may not present us with the kind of logistics challenges we have in a general election. So we don't need to be excited that we had the punctuality index for Ondo and Edo was so fine that we forget about the fact that there were very clear logistics issues for 2019 for which we shifted that election. We must address this vendor issue. What kind of provisioning do we need for vehicles? What kind of vehicles do we need? Who are the ones to supply those vehicles? When should they supply them? Those are real issues for, that we need to contend with. But when we paper over all of this and then wait until that time, we go back to the same things that we have done that probably has not given us the kind of result that we need. So for me, immediately I saw that report and I saw that multi-stakeholder election dialogue. My excitement was...
They called it a national dialogue for state and non-state actors.
Non-state actors. I was pretty excited about that. I thought that is first the way to go right now. So that when that conversation has had, there could be takeaways from there that both the National Assembly being part of that dialogue themselves, the executive being part of the dialogue, civil society being part of that dialogue, will understand what they need to take away and work on for better elections.
Thank you very much. We shall take a short break, and when we return, we'll be joined by Dr. Abubakar Kari, who is of the University of Abuja. Stay with us. We shall take a short break, and when we return, we'll be joined by Dr. Abubakar Kari, who is of the University of Abuja. Stay with us. Well, Dr. Abubakar Kari is joining us now via Zoom. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Kari. The 2019 elections took place in February, and it's taken the commission, well, about 1.5 years or thereabout to produce a report of over 400 pages. For you, does it really matter? Is the report coming late or is it coming early?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think better late than never. I think the most important thing is that INEC did a thorough stock taking. At the end of the day, they have come out with a report, and the report is fairly comprehensive. It sort of did a thorough analysis of all the goings on before, during, and after the 2019 election, with a view to identifying loopholes and blocking said. Yes, it took a year and a half, but I still believe that there is enough time, given the will, to go through the report and to implement the various recommendations, which are quite fundamental. So we should give INEC some kind of kudos, even though I must admit that the report should have come earlier than now, but as I earlier mentioned, better late than never.
So one of the critical recommendations in that report is what Ezenwa talked about earlier on. The recommendation that there should be a national dialogue involving state and non-state actors to examine pressing issues around the conduct of elections. How far do you think that can go?
Yes. I fully subscribe to that. And keen watchers of goings on within the electoral realm must admit that over the years, INEC has been getting it right because it has been able to involve these stakeholders. In most of its undertakings, at least in the time of Professor Atairu Jiga, INEC has been consulting, and a lot has been achieved through these consultations. But the one being envisaged should even be broader. Beyond the stakeholders, others should be able to join in the conversations, since what we are talking about is to try to find remedial measures to identify problems. For now, the people INEC has been doing business with majorly the civil society groups, security organizations, foreign concern, and so on and so forth. But there are others whose views can also add substance and flesh to what INEC has been doing. For instance, some of us within the intelligentsia or the academia, the members of the political class themselves, social formations such as youth, women, the PLWGs, people coming from the major institutions like the legislature, and so on and so forth. So all these things should constitute the broad stakeholders which should be able to meet, take stock of where we are and where we are and where we ought to be. There are so many issues that are crying for solutions. And I believe through these conversations, broad-based conversations, we should be able to find solutions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kari. Stay with us. Tochukwu, now this national conversation, this national dialogue is supposed to give some flesh to any proposal on amending the electoral law, as it were. Now, we know that the previous amendment, which was not signed into law, is still there. But after that time, and with the conduct of the 2019 elections, there have been a few other things that could have been, could be added to that amendment that will enhance that piece of legislation and in turn help in developing or deepening the electoral process in Nigeria. So that dialogue, that conversation, how soon should it happen? And who should be in such a dialogue?
Thank you very much once again. How soon should that dialogue happen? It should be happening already. Because, okay, let's look at the stakeholders now and itemize them one by one. And I want to start with the security. Now, for the security of elections in Nigeria, the police takes the lead. It's estimated that we have about 370,000 police officers in Nigeria. There are about 120,000 polling units in Nigeria. So it means that even if you post 3 policemen to each polling unit, we will not cover all the polling units in Nigeria. Now, from the assessment, it's estimated that we need about 500,000 police officers to cover the general elections. Now, we also have we will not need to lose sight of the fact that for off-cycle elections, like in Edo and Ondo, where people commended the activities of the police, we heard the Inspector General of Police deploying 30,000, 33,000 police officers. We know that during a general election, no state will have up to 30,000 or 33,000 police officers to monitor, provide security for that election day. To that extent, it means that there is going to be lesser number of police officers on an election day for the general election. So this stakeholder meeting also would take into consideration the fact that for security, it's impossible mathematically, arithmetically, to provide adequate security for general elections if stakeholders do not discuss. Now, for political parties, INEC has made a proposal as in part of this amendment for automation of nomination of candidates, because times will come. Let's take the Bayelsa incident. Now, times will come, the documents or the documentation or data of a candidate may not be known, except what he puts in. But if it is automated to an extent that within a few hours or minutes after you click the submit button, these things are available not just to the commission, but to every other person who can go online to source the materials. That is also part of the need why political parties need to be part of this multi-stakeholder meeting. Civil society, during election observation, they've identified a lot of things. Such a multi-stakeholder dialogue will be an avenue for them to say it straight to the faces of other stakeholders who are involved, the political parties, the INEC itself, the security agencies, and all that. The legislature, too, needs to be told directly that when there is an election in the next 4 years, the day the election ends is the day you begin planning and preparation for the next election. Now, INEC has started that, having said it's already taking care of the administrative issues, but those that need legislative attention, the legislature must know that there is no time better than now. Because if what happened to us before the 2019 should happen again in Nigeria, Nigerians will not take our legislature seriously. The international community will also not take us seriously, because it is clear that we need electoral reforms here and there. But that hasn't been done. Again, you notice that INEC says the source of ad hoc staff is now being questioned. Hitherto, it was NYSC and ASU supplying bulk of. And now when you say NYSC, ASU supplying the bulk of the ad hoc staff, and you still see the kind of electoral malpractices that these people, it therefore means that taking them from NYSC and ASU automatically does not cleanse the system. So the question is, do we sustain choosing from ASU, or do we get other sources? Do we get other professional bodies to also supply ad hoc staff to INEC? Because all returning officers are usually vice chancellors, particularly for governorship elections. They're usually vice chancellors of universities. Collation officers and returning officers from legislative elections and all of that are also from the ASU. Now, can we say, okay, NMA give us, MBA give us, NSE, the Society of Engineers give us, so that we can also know that we are strictly dealing with professionals. And we can have issues to say, can we hold these professional bodies to an extent liable for the misconduct or misdemeanor of their members where they do, and then expect them to punish these members and report back either to the legislature, to the Attorney General, or to even the commission where their members are found wanting. Because ASU has failed, and we have to be frank about that. ASU has failed. We have not heard, and I doubt even if ASU has the powers to sanction a member to that extent. Now, what have the universities done to sanction any member or any staff?
I think there's a problem there. The ASU as a professional body is not involved in election election returning officers. The universities are. Now, and there's a difference, you know that.
ASU supplies a list to the universities, and the universities forward the list.
The ASU members are staff of the universities.
It's not necessarily so. The vice chancellors are not members of ASU. Many professors are not members of ASU.
Yeah, that's what I mean when I say members of ASU are staff of the university. So it's the university's responsibility. It's the university that actually releases them for that assignment.
And I know you know this. What I just wanted to correct was the impression that
ASU is responsible. I admit.
Yes. And in any case,
so that we don't.
Yes. And in any case, in most cases, these returning officers are not the ones who perpetrate the electoral malfeasance that happens during the election.
They are just announcers.
Exactly.
They are
collation officers participate. No, let's not just call them just announcers, because I followed closely the Imo North senatorial election in 2019. The man declared the results before the results came in. INEC set up a panel, if you all remember. INEC set up a panel to investigate that. And just days before the panel report was turned in, the man quickly got an order of court to stop that panel report from being made public. But even before then, and even with what INEC filed in the tribunal, INEC was clear that the result sheet on which he declared, on which the results were written, was not the result sheet that was given to him by INEC. And then the collation sheets were not the collation sheets INEC gave him, because INEC still claimed that they had the blank sheets that were ordinarily given to him, which were retrieved, and they were still blank, meaning that there was nothing written on them. And it was a lecturer that did that. So don't just call them announcers, because they are, at least I can give facts to that one. Yes. So they are not just, they can manipulate results. Also, in Imo, the Federal House of Representatives election, I know there is Okigwe North and South. I think it's Okigwe South, it's called. One of the House of Rep seats in Okigwe senatorial zone, in the same district. The results that the collation officer announced, now, there are 3 local governments in that federal constituency. 2 were declared on the day of the general election. 1 local government was kept pending, a member, not specifically, was kept pending, and the collation officer was asked to go days later to go and complete the collation. But the results he turned in should have ordinarily been added to the results earlier declared, and the results would have been known. But by the time people calculated the results and they knew their winner, the returning officer now announced the result, which showed another person was the winner. So they are not just announcers. Okay. They have a role, a critical role to play.
Yusuf?
Yeah, I think INEC totally acknowledged the fact that there are a lot of issues with collation process and even the conduct of elections at the polling unit. And I think one of the things that we need to applaud INEC for is the IRF platform, which they launched, and which I think is our responsibilities as non-state actors to also fully utilize on that IRF platform in terms of independently doing the calculation of the results being uploaded there. And also drawing our attention of INEC to the fact that some of these from EC8A are not uploaded on time on that platform, because in Ondo election they actually tried, in which like over 70% of that form was uploaded few hours after the elections, and we've also seen that it wasn't fully completed until the next day. So it's important for us to then acknowledge the fact that we all also have responsibilities. INEC has been making effort to ensure that the process is transparent. Coming back to the issue of multi-stakeholders dialogue, which Mr. Izenwa actually emphasized, and which reflected in the INEC recommendation in its report. I think that is very important, but we also need to extend that conversation beyond some of the key things highlighted by INEC in the report. We need to look critically at the kind of party system we need to practice. The multi-party democracy, we need to do thorough assessment of it. Do we need 91 political parties? Do we need independent candidacy? These are some of the fundamental questions we need to ask ourselves at that platform. And I also think that inter-party democracy is also very crucial, and we need to have sincere conversation, not just about somebody should not cross carpet from one party to the other, but we need to look at what is the root of some of these challenges that we're facing. And I will always say, and continue to say, the fact that the behavior and attitude of politicians are more or less is anti-democratic, and we need to address that before we can move ahead. And I will also point to the fact that INEC recommended that in that report that they will review to ensure that retired INEC staff are being recruited as ad hoc staff. The question I asked myself was that how many are they? Would they be enough to man election?
In addition to all the others that they will be recruiting.
The thing is that...
And that, of course, will also mean that it will be clean INEC staff.
Reviewing, we live in a very complex society. If you try as much as possible to understand it, you realize that you don't understand anything. So we need to think deeply into some of these challenges, because if those challenges that made, for example, in Edo or Ondo election, we actually received the report that some of these ad hoc staff who are supposed to be NYC officers, or who are NYC officers and deployed to some of these police units, they are known in that area to be partisan. They are accused of being card-carrying members of some political parties. INEC wouldn't know this, but those people who man that process of recruiting these people are the people who are at fault. So we need to look at the key challenges that makes this process of recruiting these people compromised, and start addressing those challenges before we can talk about it. Definitely, INEC retired staff are issues, but I also think INEC needs to take some of the key steps that it has started taking, particularly the issue of the returning officers suing them and taking them to court to ensure that they face the wrath of law. I think INEC needs to deepen its effort in getting that done. I also would like to say that with regards to returning, I think we also need a legal constitutional reform for that, electoral reform, which mandate INEC to take hook, line, and sinker whatever information results dump on its table by the returning officer. I think it's something that we need to take serious, and advocacy needs to go beyond the dialogue. Advocacy needs to look at what can media do, which I also think is one of the fundamental things we need to have a conclusion on. What can media do moving forward after the stakeholders dialogue? What can civil society actors do? Because some of these things shouldn't just be built around some of the critical actors that we all know ourselves on a daily basis. Citizens also need to be part of the process. So how can we bring citizens on board to ensure that their voices are heard?
All right, Dr. Kari, I'm sure you've been very attentive to our studio guests. One other very critical issue as far as INEC and elections is concerned is funding. Was that properly dealt with in this report?
To be frank, I have not gone through the report thoroughly, but I think the issue of funding is very important. The other time, INEC insisted that they should draw its money through the first line
charge.
Yeah, okay, charge. And I think it has been done. The issue now is whether INEC has adequate funding to prosecute its activities. I have read a few days ago about some kind of training. The INEC chairman complained that if he had to approve that training, then about 3/4 of INEC funding will go to that particular training, and there may not be enough money to prosecute other things. So the reality is that up to now, INEC is not being adequately funded. And this is quite unfortunate, if not dangerous, because we will not be able to realize free, fair, transparent, and credible election. INEC is adequately funded. So it is something that is worth looking at, perhaps not necessarily constitutionally, but there should be some kind of resolve that at any point in time, steps must be taken to ensure that INEC is provided with the kind of funding that it requires at all times. We cannot afford to staff INEC of the necessary funds, because that will make it open to manipulation, particularly by politicians who may want to capitalize on the fact that some activities of INEC are not properly funded to try to combat. And we know very well that politicians, they have been capitalizing on this kind of loopholes for now. So steps must be taken to ensure that this kind of things do not continue. Some of the logistical problems that INEC has been facing, perhaps, is because of this lack of proper funding. So for us to address this problem, INEC must be properly funded.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Abubakar Kari. I wish we had a lot more time on our hands, but on a final note, Ezenwa, moving forward, 17, 18 months to the next election, what are those signposts that we must have in place almost immediately?
You just dealt with one, the politics of funding. And that politics is real. First line charge, okay. Release is another thing. So part of the challenge that INEC faced in 2019 was that most of its procurement was on credit. And by the time the monies came, it creates that fire brigade thing that I talked about. And one of the ways that happens is that if you want to nibble at the independence of INEC, you make it to go cap in hand. Once it starts going cap in hand to beg for release for its money, then there is a tendency to say, look, if you want this money released, there is something you have to give us back. And once you do that, that independence is already eroded. So those are part of the politics of funding of INEC should go beyond the first line charge to instruments that makes it possible for them to have their money when they need it and deploy that resources to get the the kind of effectiveness and efficiency they require.
But not be subjected to political manipulation of any sort.
Whether from the executive or the legislature.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time. Ezewa Nwagu, Chairman, Partners for Electoral Reforms. And, of course, he's been joined by Yusuf Shamsuddin. Yusuf is the Principal Programs Officer, Center for Democracy and Development. And Mr. Azurike Tochukwu, who is the Director, Legal and Documentation, Center for Transparency Advocacy. Thank you, gentlemen, in the studio for your time. And Dr. Abubakar Kari, who joined us via Zoom. He is a lecturer at the University of Abuja. Thank you so much, Dr. Kari. All right, that's our program for today. My name is Imonia Marere. Please join us again on Friday when we bring you a fresh edition of People, Politics, and Power. Thank you for investing your time with us.